Translate this, and my fortune is yours. Billionaire laughed. She set down the ancient parchment with steady hands, her voice cutting through the stunned silence like crystal. Your fortune awaits, Mr. Lancaster, but perhaps you should have asked if I wanted it. The room full of Chicago's elite held its breath as billionaire Theodore Lancaster's face went white, realizing he'd just been intellectually checkmated by the woman he'd spent 3 years treating as invisible furniture. Dr. Helena Voss's magnifying glass clattered to the floor. Senator Phillips' wine glass froze halfway to his lips. The housekeeper they'd all dismissed as just the help had just delivered a flawless translation of an ancient text that had stumped 3 different experts. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like the video, and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories. And trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let me take you back to where this story really began, 6 hours earlier, when a billionaire thought he was setting up entertainment and instead walked straight into the most humbling night of his privileged life. The December wind howled across Lake Michigan as Theodore Lancaster III stood before his bathroom mirror in his Gold Coast mansion, adjusting a crimson silk tie with practiced precision. At 42, he possessed the kind of sharp-featured handsomeness that money could maintain: steel gray eyes, perfectly styled dark hair with distinguished silver at the temples, and a jawline that spoke of generations of privilege. His charcoal Armani suit hugged his tall frame as he practiced his smile in the mirror, the same calculated expression he'd worn through countless board meetings and charity galas. Perfect evening for a party, he murmured to his reflection, though his eyes held no warmth. The smile never reached them. It never had to. 3 floors below, Evelyn Carter moved through the mansion's kitchen with quiet efficiency, her movements precise and purposeful. At 38, she carried herself with a dignity that years of invisible labor couldn't diminish. Her rich brown skin glowed under the warm kitchen lights, and despite the simple navy uniform she wore, there was an elegance in the way she arranged the catered appetizers on crystal platters. Her thick curls were pulled back in a practical bun, revealing high cheekbones and intelligent dark eyes that missed nothing, though she'd learned long ago to keep her observations to herself. She glanced at the clock, 6:47 p.m. The guests would arrive in 13 minutes, and everything had to be flawless. It always did. Evelyn. Theodore's voice boomed from the top of the grand staircase. Where are my cufflinks? The gold ones with the family crest. In your jewelry box, sir. 3rd compartment, left side. She called back, not looking up from arranging white roses in a Waterford vase. She'd retrieved them from the safe an hour ago, anticipating his needs, as she always did. Theodore descended the spiral staircase, each step echoing through the marble foyer. The walls displayed his collection of rare artifacts: ancient Roman coins, medieval manuscripts, Egyptian pottery, trophies of his wealth and supposed sophistication. He paused before a newly acquired piece, a fragment of papyrus with strange markings, mounted in an elaborate gold frame. Magnificent, isn't it? He said to no one in particular, though Evelyn was the only one within earshot. Bought it last week from a private collector in Boston. 3rd century, they claim. Complete mystery what it says. He chuckled, the sound hollow in the vast space. Not that it matters. It's the prestige of owning it that counts. Evelyn's hands stilled on the roses for just a moment. Her eyes flicked to the papyrus, then back to her work. I'm sure your guests will be impressed, sir. They always are. Theodore straightened his tie one final time. Make sure the Chateau Margaux is properly decanted. Senator Phillips has expensive tastes, and I need his vote on the harbor development project. Already done, sir. The 1982 vintage, as you requested. He nodded, not with gratitude, but with the casual acknowledgement one might give a well-functioning machine. In Theodore's world, Evelyn was furniture. Useful, necessary, but hardly worth noticing as a person. She'd been cleaning his home, preparing his meals, and managing his domestic life for 3 years. Yet he knew virtually nothing about her, beyond her ability to anticipate his needs. The first guests arrived precisely at 7. Senator Phillips and his wife, followed by Judge Morrison, then the cultural elite of Chicago's North Shore. Theodore greeted each with his practiced charm, every handshake calculated, every laugh perfectly timed. "Theodore, darling," gushed Mrs. Pemberton, wife of the city's largest construction magnate. Her emerald silk dress sparkled under the chandelier light. "What an absolutely divine gathering. And is that a new acquisition I spy on your wall?" "Sharp-eye Constance." Theodore guided her toward the mounted papyrus. 3rd century Roman manuscript. Completely untranslated. "My antiquities dealer says it could be anything, a love letter, a shopping list, perhaps even a fragment of lost poetry." Judge Morrison, a portly man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, leaned closer to examine the ancient text. "Fascinating markings. Latin-based, you think? Could be Greek, could be Aramaic. Who knows?" Theodore shrugged with feigned nonchalance. "I collect mysteries, not solutions." As the evening progressed, Evelyn moved through the gathering like a shadow, refilling glasses, clearing plates, ensuring every detail remained perfect. She observed the guests' conversations, their casual dismissal of art's meaning in favor of its monetary value, their comfortable assumption that intelligence and education belonged exclusively to their circle. "The problem with these ancient texts," Senator Phillips was saying, gesturing with his wine glass, "is that we'll never truly know what wisdom they contained. The knowledge is lost forever." "Rather romantic, actually," added Mrs. Pemberton. "All those secrets locked away in dead languages." Theodore laughed, the sound carrying across the room. "Knowledge is power, but only if you can understand it. Otherwise, it's just expensive decoration." From the kitchen doorway, Evelyn watched the papyrus on the wall, its careful script visible even from her distance. Her fingers traced absent patterns against her apron as she studied the markings, her mind working quietly behind her composed expression. "More wine, ma'am?" she asked Mrs. Pemberton, appearing beside her with silent grace. "Oh," the woman startled slightly. "Yes, thank you. You're quite stealthy, aren't you?" "I try not to interrupt, ma'am." "How thoughtful." Mrs. Pemberton's tone carried the kind of dismissive kindness reserved for well-trained pets. "Theodore, your help is remarkably efficient." "The best money can buy," Theodore replied without looking at Evelyn. "She's been here 3 years, and I've never had to repeat an instruction." Perfect understanding of her place. Evelyn's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as she moved to the next guest. In her peripheral vision, she caught Theodore's reflection in the dining room mirror, satisfied, superior, completely unaware that the woman he'd just dismissed had been following every word of their intellectual posturing with growing interest. "What do you suppose it says?" Judge Morrison mused, still studying the papyrus. "Some ancient recipe? A merchant's accounts? Could be a love poem," suggested Mrs. Phillips dreamily. "Something passionate and timeless." "Or the curse," added Theodore with theatrical drama. "Ancient revenge against enemies long dead." The group laughed, delighted by the mystery they believed would remain forever unsolved. None of them noticed Evelyn pause in clearing their dessert plates, her eyes fixing on the ancient script with an intensity that would have surprised them all. As midnight approached and the last guest departed, Theodore loosened his tie, satisfaction radiating from every pore. Another successful evening, another step closer to securing Senator Phillips' support. He surveyed his domain, the empty crystal glasses, the depleted wine bottles, the satisfied silence of a party well executed. "Clean this up, would you?" he called to Evelyn, already heading toward the staircase. "And don't forget to lock the display case. That manuscript is worth a fortune." "Of course, sir." Evelyn began collecting the glasses, her movements as graceful as always. But as Theodore's footsteps faded up the stairs, she found herself drawn once again to the mounted papyrus, its ancient words seeming to call to her across the centuries. She stepped closer, studying the careful script in the soft light of the remaining candles. Her lips moved silently, and for just a moment, her carefully maintained composure cracked, revealing something deeper, a hunger for knowledge, for recognition, for the chance to prove that intelligence had nothing to do with bank accounts or social connections. Tomorrow would bring another day of invisible service, of anticipating needs and managing details for a man who saw her as nothing more than efficient help. But tonight, alone with the mysterious words of the ancients, Evelyn Carter allowed herself to hope that someday her own hidden treasures might finally see the light. The following Saturday evening arrived with fresh snowfall blanketing Chicago's Gold Coast, transforming the city into a winter wonderland that Theodore's guests admired through the warm glow of his mansion's windows. The dinner party was smaller this time. 8 carefully selected individuals whose influence could advance Theodore's latest venture, a luxury resort development on the Michigan shoreline. Dr. Helena Voss, a renowned archaeologist from Northwestern University, had been Theodore's prize invitation. Her silver hair was swept into an elegant chignon, and her steel-blue eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who'd spent decades deciphering humanity's oldest mysteries. She wore a deep purple dress that commanded respect without demanding attention. "Theodore, your collection continues to astound," Dr. Voss said, accepting a glass of champagne from Evelyn's silver tray. "Though I must admit, I'm particularly curious about that papyrus fragment. May I examine it more closely?" Theodore's chest swelled with pride. Having Dr. Voss acknowledge his collection felt like academic validation. "By all means, I acquired it through Sotheby's last month. Provenance traces back to a monastery library in Alexandria." As the group gathered around the mounted fragment, Evelyn continued her silent service, but her attention sharpened. She positioned herself near the display, ostensibly to dust the nearby mahogany side table, but her eyes remained fixed on the ancient text. Dr. Voss pulled out a small magnifying glass, studying the script with professional intensity. "Fascinating. The letter forms suggest late Hellenistic period, possibly 2nd or 3rd century. The papyrus quality is exceptional for its age." "Can you read it?" asked Jonathan Hartwell, Theodore's investment partner, a man whose red hair and freckled complexion made him look younger than his 45 years. "Some portions, yes. It appears to be personal correspondence. I can make out references to beloved and what might be distance or separation." Dr. Voss frowned slightly. "Those several words are quite archaic. The dialect is unusual." Theodore couldn't resist inserting himself into the conversation. "I've had 3 different experts examine it. None could provide a complete translation. The seller suggested it might be impossible to fully decode." "Nothing's impossible," Dr. Voss replied firmly. "Just challenging." From across the room, Judge Morrison raised his wine glass. "To Theodore's impossible mysteries, may they remain beautifully unsolved forever." The group laughed and raised their glasses in response. Theodore basked in the attention, his smile widening as he prepared to deliver what he considered his evening's entertainment. "You know," he said, his voice taking on the theatrical tone he used for his favorite stories, "impossible reminds me of something amusing. Dr. Voss, you've spent your career making the impossible possible, haven't you? Decoding ancient languages, solving archaeological puzzles that have stumped scholars for centuries." "It's been my life's work, yes." Theodore's eyes glittered with mischief. "Then perhaps you'd appreciate a little experiment I've been considering." He gestured toward Evelyn, who was carefully arranging fresh flowers in a nearby vase. "Evelyn, would you join us for a moment?" Evelyn's hands stilled on the white lilies. She turned slowly, her expression carefully neutral. "Yes, sir. Our Dr. Voss here is a master of ancient languages. She's made a career of solving the unsolvable." Theodore's voice carried an edge of cruel amusement. "It occurs to me that if someone of her caliber finds this text challenging, it would be quite entertaining to see how someone without formal education might fare." The room fell quiet, sensing the shift in Theodore's tone. Dr. Voss's expression tightened with disapproval, but Theodore continued, oblivious to her discomfort. "Evelyn has been with us for 3 years. Excellent at her job, naturally, but I doubt she's ever encountered anything more complex than a grocery list." He gestured grandly toward the papyrus. "What do you say, Evelyn? Care to try your hand at translation?" If you can decode even a single word, I'll give you. He paused dramatically, $100,000. The number hung in the air like a challenge. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, while others leaned forward with voyeuristic interest. Evelyn remained perfectly still, her dark eyes moving from Theodore to the papyrus and back again. "Sir, I don't think that's necessary," she said quietly. "Oh, but I insist." Theodore's voice grew louder, more animated. "Think of it as educational television, live entertainment. Dr. Voss can judge the accuracy of any attempts." He turned to his guests with conspiratorial excitement. "What do you think? Shall we make it interesting? If Evelyn can provide any meaningful translation, any at all, she wins the money. If not, well, we'll have proven that expertise matters." Mrs. Pemberton giggled nervously. "Theodore, really this seems brilliant?" he interrupted. "I think so too. Come now, Evelyn. $100,000 for a simple translation. Surely that's worth a try." Jonathan Hartwell cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should return to dinner." "Nonsense." Theodore waved dismissively. "This is the most interesting thing to happen at one of my parties in years. Evelyn, the papyrus is right there. Just tell us what it says." "How hard could it be?" Dr. Voss stepped forward, her voice sharp with professional indignation. "Theodore, this is inappropriate. Translation requires years of study, understanding of historical context, familiarity with linguistic evolution." "Exactly my point." Theodore beamed as if she'd supported his argument. "Which makes this fascinating. Here we have someone with none of those qualifications being offered a small fortune to attempt the impossible. It's like asking a child to perform surgery, amusing in its very impossibility." Evelyn's composed mask slipped for just an instant, revealing a flash of pain that quickly hardened into something else. She stepped closer to the mounted papyrus, her eyes scanning the ancient script while the room held its collective breath. "Sir," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "you're certain about your offer? $100,000 for a translation." "Absolutely certain. Though I should mention, Dr. Voss here will verify any claims. We can't have made-up nonsense passing for scholarship." Theodore's smile was sharp as a blade. "But please take your time. Study it carefully. I'm sure our guests would enjoy watching the process." The cruelty in his tone was unmistakable now. This wasn't education or entertainment. It was humiliation designed to reinforce the social order that kept him elevated and others in their place. Evelyn understood this perfectly, just as she understood the weight of every eye in the room watching her, waiting for her inevitable failure. She approached the papyrus slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. The ancient Greek letters seemed to shimmer in the candlelight, their familiar shapes calling to memories she'd buried deep. Behind her, she could feel Theodore's satisfaction radiating like heat from a flame. "Take all the time you need," he said magnanimously. "Though I should warn you, 3 different experts have tried and failed. But perhaps you'll see something they missed." Evelyn's fingers traced the air just inches from the protected glass, following the script's rhythm. The words whispered to her across 2 millennia, their meaning as clear as if they'd been written yesterday. She closed her eyes briefly, making a choice that would change everything. When she opened them again, her voice was clear and strong. "It's a love letter," she said, "written by a woman named Kyra to her husband Alexios, who is serving with the Roman legions in Gaul. She writes, 'My dearest heart, the olive trees you planted before your departure have begun to bloom, and I see your face in every silver leaf. The distance between us grows heavier with each passing moon, but I carry your words like treasures in my heart.'" The room went dead silent. Dr. Voss's magnifying glass clattered to the floor. "She continues," Evelyn said, her voice gaining strength. "Our daughter speaks your name each morning, though she barely remembers your voice. I tell her stories of your courage, your gentleness, the way you sang to her when storms frightened her sleep. Come home to us, my beloved. Come home before winter steals another year from our embrace." Theodore's face had gone white. "You're making that up. You have to be." Evelyn turned to face him, and for the first time in 3 years, She looked him directly in the eyes. Shall I continue? There's more. She mentions their daughter's age, 7 years, and describes the specific hills visible from their villa. She references the festival of Demeter that occurred the month before his departure, and asks him to send word through Marcus Flavius, a merchant who traded regularly between Gaul and Alexandria. Dr. Voss retrieved her magnifying glass with shaking hands, studying the text with renewed intensity. The names, yes, Kyra Alexios, Marcus Flavius, they're all here. The festival of Demeter, good God, how did you? Read the last line, Evelyn said quietly, her eyes never leaving Theodore's shocked face. The closing. Dr. Voss squinted through her magnifying glass, her voice barely a whisper as she read. Until stars forget their places in the sky, I remain your devoted Kyra. She looked up, her academic composure completely shattered. This is perfect. Not just the words, but the meaning, the cultural context, the emotional authenticity. Theodore's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Around the room, his guests stared in stunned silence, the social order they'd taken for granted suddenly tilting on its axis. Your fortune awaits, Mr. Lancaster, Evelyn said, her voice cutting through the silence like crystal. But perhaps you should have asked if I wanted it. The silence stretched like a taut wire until Theodore's nervous laughter shattered it, the sound brittle and desperate in the vast dining room. His face had regained some color, though his hands trembled slightly as he reached for his wine glass. Well, he said, forcing his practiced smile back into place, that was certainly creative. Very entertaining, Evelyn. You have quite an imagination. Dr. Voss looked up sharply from the papyrus, her magnifying glass still pressed against the ancient text. Theodore, this isn't imagination. Every detail she provided is accurate. The historical references, the geographical markers, even the linguistic patterns are perfect. Come now, Helena. Theodore's voice carried a forced joviality that fooled no one. You can't seriously believe my housekeeper just happened to translate a text that stumped your colleagues. It's clearly memorized from somewhere. Perhaps she overheard our earlier conversation and invented something plausible. Evelyn stepped back from the display case, her hands clasped behind her back in the deferential posture Theodore expected from his staff. But her eyes held a new fire that hadn't been there an hour ago. You're suggesting I fabricated specific historical details about 2nd century Roman military assignments in Gaul? She asked quietly. Including the names of merchants who traded between Alexandria and Lutetia during the reign of Marcus Aurelius? I'm suggesting, Theodore said, his voice hardening, that there's been some kind of mistake. Perhaps you read about this text online, found an existing translation. There is no existing translation. Dr. Voss interrupted, her professional integrity outweighing her social politeness. I've researched this piece extensively since you acquired it. The dialect is extremely rare, a fusion of classical Greek with Coptic influences that requires deep familiarity with both linguistic traditions. Theodore's smile was becoming more strained by the moment. Helena, surely you're not implying that my domestic help possesses advanced degrees in classical languages. The condescension in his tone made several guests shift uncomfortably. Mrs. Pemberton examined her manicured nails with sudden fascination, while Judge Morrison found urgent business with his pocket watch. What I'm implying, Dr. Voss said carefully, is that accurate translation requires knowledge, regardless of where that knowledge was acquired. Knowledge that takes years to develop, Theodore shot back. Decades of study, not something acquired by. He gestured vaguely toward Evelyn, watching educational programs or reading Wikipedia articles. Jonathan Hartwell cleared his throat awkwardly. Perhaps we should simply honor the wager. You did offer. I offered payment for genuine translation, not parlor tricks. Theodore's mask of civility was slipping rapidly. Any competent actress could memorize a plausible-sounding story. The real question is where she acquired the information to construct such an elaborate deception. Evelyn remained silent, watching Theodore's desperate attempt to rationalize what he'd witnessed. She'd seen this before in academic circles during her graduate years, brilliant minds unable to accept evidence that contradicted their fundamental assumptions about the world. You want proof? Dr. Voss pulled out her phone, scrolling quickly through her contacts. Professor Martinez at the Oriental Institute specializes in Coptic influences on Hellenistic texts. Let me call him right now. That won't be necessary, Theodore said quickly, panic flickering across his features. I simply think we should be cautious about drawing hasty conclusions. The only hasty conclusion here, Dr. Voss replied coolly, is your assumption that education and intelligence correlate with social position. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Theodore's other guests suddenly found fascinating reasons to study their shoes, the artwork, anything except the growing tension between their host and his increasingly agitated academic guest. Helena, I think you're overreacting, Theodore said, attempting to regain control of the situation. This is my home, my party, and my employee. I know Evelyn quite well after 3 years, and I can assure you that while she's excellent at her duties, she possesses no advanced academic credentials. Have you ever asked her about her educational background? Dr. Voss challenged. Theodore blinked, the question catching him off guard. Why would I need to? Her resume was perfectly adequate for her position. Her resume, Dr. Voss repeated slowly. The one that qualified her to clean your house and serve your meals. You never thought to inquire about anything beyond her domestic capabilities? Dr. Voss, Evelyn interjected softly, it's perfectly understandable that Mr. Lancaster would focus on job-relevant qualifications. My ability to manage his household is what matters in our professional relationship. But her diplomatic words carried an undercurrent that made Theodore even more uncomfortable. There was something in her tone, a careful control that suggested vast depths beneath the surface he'd never bothered to explore. Exactly. Theodore latched onto her apparent support gratefully. Evelyn understands her role here perfectly. This entire situation is simply an unfortunate misunderstanding. Misunderstanding of what? Asked Senator Phillips, speaking for the first time since the translation began. His political instincts were clearly analyzing the dynamics of power and embarrassment playing out before him. Of what constitutes genuine scholarly achievement versus... Theodore paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound too explicitly dismissive. Enthusiastic amateur interpretation. Dr. Voss's eyes flashed with anger. Amateur? Theodore, she just provided a flawless translation of one of the most challenging texts I've encountered in 20 years of professional archaeology. Her understanding of the historical context is sophisticated enough to identify specific trade routes and military postings. That's not amateur work. Then explain to me how my housekeeper acquired such knowledge, Theodore demanded, his voice rising slightly. Because I can guarantee you she didn't attend Harvard or Yale. Her background check was quite thorough. Maybe, Mrs. Pemberton ventured timidly, she studied these things in her spare time? Some people enjoy learning as a hobby. Theodore laughed, but the sound held no humor. Constance, translating ancient Greek isn't like doing crossword puzzles. It requires formal training, structured education, access to specialized resources. You don't just pick it up from library books. Actually, Dr. Voss said quietly, some of the most brilliant linguists I've known were self-taught. Passion for knowledge often trumps formal credentials. Passion, Theodore repeated mockingly. How romantic. But passion doesn't explain the technical accuracy of what we just heard. There's something else going on here, and I intend to discover what it is. Evelyn had remained perfectly still throughout this exchange, her face composed despite the storm of accusation and defense swirling around her. When she finally spoke, her voice cut through the argument like a blade. Mr. Lancaster, would you prefer I return to the kitchen? I believe the dessert service requires attention. The suggestion hung in the air, offering Theodore an escape from the increasingly uncomfortable situation. He could dismiss her, return to the safe predictability of his carefully ordered world, and pretend the last hour had never happened. Yes, he said quickly, relief evident in his voice. Yes, please see to the dessert. And perhaps we can have some coffee as well. Of course, sir. Evelyn moved toward the kitchen with her usual grace, but something had fundamentally changed. The invisible barrier that had always separated her from Theodore's world had developed cracks, and light was beginning to seep through. As she disappeared into the kitchen, Dr. Voss turned to Theodore with barely contained fury. "You're making a serious mistake." "The only mistake," Theodore replied firmly, "would be allowing an entertaining evening to spiral into academic controversy over a domestic employee's amateur dramatics." But even as he spoke the words, Theodore's eyes drifted back to the mounted papyrus, and for the first time since acquiring it, he wondered what other secrets his beautiful, mysterious artifact might contain. More troubling still, he found himself wondering what other secrets moved quietly through his house each day, invisible to his privileged gaze. In the kitchen, Evelyn prepared the coffee service with mechanical precision, her hands steady despite the turmoil in her heart. She'd made her choice, stepped briefly into the light, and now she had to decide whether to retreat back into the shadows or risk everything by standing in the brightness a little longer. The ancient words of Kyra echoed in her mind, "Until stars forget their places in the sky." Some loves, some truths were worth any risk. The first snowflakes had begun falling during dessert, but by 10 o'clock, the gentle winter wonderland had transformed into something far more serious. Wind howled against the mansion's windows with increasing fury, and what had started as picturesque flurries now fell in thick, blinding sheets that made the streetlights barely visible from Theodore's front parlor. "Good heavens," Mrs. Pemberton murmured, pressing her face to the window. "I can't even see my car in the driveway." Judge Morrison checked his phone with growing concern. "Weather Service is calling it a blizzard warning now. They're advising everyone to stay off the roads until morning." Theodore felt his carefully orchestrated evening slipping further from his control. The translation incident had already left him unsettled, and now Mother Nature was conspiring to trap him with witnesses to his discomfort. "Surely it's not that severe," he said, though the violent rattling of the windows suggested otherwise. "Chicago winters are always dramatic, but they pass quickly." Dr. Voss pulled up a weather radar on her tablet, her expression grave. "This storm system is massive. The entire metropolitan area is under emergency advisories. Lake effect is creating whiteout conditions." Senator Phillips, ever practical, was already on his phone with his security detail. "My driver says visibility is less than 10 feet. He's recommending we wait until the plows can clear the main roads." "Well," Theodore said with forced cheerfulness, "I suppose we'll have an extended evening. The guest rooms are always prepared, and there's plenty of food and wine to keep us comfortable." But comfort was the last thing he felt as he watched his guests settle in for an unexpected overnight stay. The translation scene had already disrupted his social equilibrium, and now he was trapped with Dr. Voss, whose disapproving glances made him increasingly defensive. In the kitchen, Evelyn worked quietly to prepare additional accommodations. She'd anticipated the storm's severity hours before the Weather Service issued warnings, having learned to read the lake's moods during her years in Chicago. Extra linens appeared in guest rooms, coffee supplies were restocked, and she discreetly checked that the mansion's backup generator was functioning properly. "Evelyn," Theodore called from the parlor, his voice carrying an edge of irritation. "We'll need breakfast for 8 tomorrow morning. Can you manage that on short notice?" "Of course, sir. I'll prepare a full breakfast buffet." She paused in folding fresh towels. "Will your guests require anything specific for the evening? Additional pillows, reading materials? Just handle whatever needs handling. You're good at that." The dismissive tone rankled more than usual after the evening's events, but Evelyn maintained her professional composure. She'd survived worse than Theodore Lancaster's wounded pride, and she could certainly survive one night of enforced proximity. As the guests dispersed to their assigned rooms, Dr. Voss lingered in the parlor, studying the papyrus display with renewed intensity. Theodore found himself reluctantly drawn back to the artifact that had caused such disruption to his ordered world. Still convinced it's some kind of elaborate hoax, Dr. Voss asked without looking up from her magnifying glass. "I'm convinced," Theodore replied carefully, "that there's more to this situation than meets the eye. There always is." Dr. Voss straightened, fixing him with her sharp blue gaze. The question is whether you're interested in discovering the truth or simply protecting your assumptions. Theodore bristled at the implication. I'm a businessman, Helena. I deal in facts, not romantic notions about hidden genius among the working class. And yet the facts you witnessed tonight suggest your worldview might need adjustment. Before Theodore could respond, the lights flickered ominously. The winds howling intensified, and somewhere in the house, a shutter began banging rhythmically against the exterior wall. I should check the generator. Evelyn's voice came from the doorway, where she'd appeared with her usual silent efficiency. The power grid sometimes struggles during lake effect storms. Yes, do that, Theodore said quickly, grateful for the interruption. And make sure the backup heating system is operational. These old mansions can get quite cold. As Evelyn disappeared toward the basement, Dr. Voss continued her examination of the papyrus. Theodore, may I ask you something personal? That depends on how personal. When you hired Evelyn, what did her resume tell you about her background? Theodore shifted uncomfortably. The basics, previous employment, references, that sort of thing. She'd worked for several prominent families, always received excellent recommendations. But nothing about her education, her personal history before domestic work. Why would that matter? I needed someone to manage my household, not write my biography. Dr. Voss lowered her magnifying glass, studying Theodore with the same intensity she'd applied to the ancient text. You shared a house with this woman for 3 years. You've trusted her with your daily life, your privacy, your personal space. And you never once wondered who she really was. The question hung between them like an accusation. Theodore realized with uncomfortable clarity that he knew virtually nothing about Evelyn Carter beyond her professional capabilities. He couldn't say where she'd grown up, whether she had family, what her dreams or disappointments might be. She'd been scenery in his life, functional and pleasant, but essentially invisible. She's very private, he said defensively. Professional. I respected her boundaries. Where you never bothered to look beyond your own convenience. The lights flickered again, more severely this time, and the house plunged into darkness for several long seconds before the backup generator kicked in. Emergency lighting cast everything in stark, unfamiliar shadows. Well, Dr. Voss said dryly, it seems the storm has decided to make this evening even more interesting. Evelyn reappeared in the parlor doorway, carrying a battery-powered lantern that cast warm light across her features. The main power lines are down, but the generator is functioning properly. We should have heat and basic lighting throughout the night. Excellent, Theodore said, though excellence was the last thing he felt about his current situation. Anything else we need to know? The phone lines are down as well, and cell towers are experiencing intermittent outages. We're essentially isolated until the storm passes. Isolated. The word seemed to echo in the sudden quiet that followed the generator's steady hum. Theodore looked around his parlor, seeing it differently in the emergency lighting. The familiar space felt smaller, more intimate, stripped of its usual grandeur. How long do these storms typically last? Senator Phillips asked, emerging from his assigned guest room in silk pajamas and a worried expression. Lake effect can be unpredictable, Evelyn replied. Sometimes they pass in a few hours, sometimes they settle in for days. This one feels substantial. Days. Theodore's carefully controlled world was potentially facing days of disruption, trapped with guests who'd witnessed his humiliation and a housekeeper who'd shattered his fundamental assumptions about intelligence and class. Well, he said with forced brightness, I suppose we'll make the best of it. Perhaps we can treat this as an adventure. But adventure was precisely what Theodore had spent his life avoiding. He preferred predictability, control, the comfortable certainty that came from surrounding himself with people who knew their places and stayed in them. As his guests gradually settled into their temporary accommodations, Theodore found himself alone in the parlor with the papyrus display. In the emergency lighting, the ancient text seemed to glow with mysterious significance. He thought of Kyra's words, her love reaching across centuries to touch a modern heart, and wondered what other voices from the past might be waiting for someone skilled enough to hear them. Upstairs, he could hear muffled conversations as his guests adapted to their unexpected sleepover. Dr. Voss was probably still analyzing the evening's events, drawing scholarly conclusions that would make him even more uncomfortable. Senator Phillips was likely calculating the political implications of being stranded in a situation involving social awkwardness and academic controversy. In the kitchen, soft sounds indicated that Evelyn was preparing for the extended stay, ensuring his guests' comfort with the same quiet competence she applied to everything. But tonight, her efficiency felt different. Tonight, he was acutely aware that behind her professional mask lay depths he'd never bothered to explore. The storm raged outside, trapping them all in this moment of suspended reality where normal social rules had been disrupted and anything might happen. Theodore stood before the papyrus, reading Kyra's eternal words of love and longing, and realized that his own comfortable certainties had been shaken as thoroughly as the mansion's windows. By morning, the storm would pass and normal life would resume. But some changes, once begun, could never be completely undone. And in the emergency lighting of his disrupted world, Theodore was beginning to understand that the most important discoveries often came from the most unexpected sources. The storm had settled into a steady, hypnotic rhythm by 2 in the morning, and the mansion felt suspended in time, cut off from the outside world by walls of swirling snow. Theodore found sleep impossible, his mind churning with questions that had never troubled him before. He wandered the halls in his burgundy silk robe, the emergency lighting casting unfamiliar shadows on walls he'd known for 15 years. As he passed the kitchen, he noticed a soft glow emanating from within. Curious, he peered around the doorframe and discovered Evelyn seated at the small staff table, a battery-powered reading lamp illuminating an open book. She wore a simple, gray sweater and dark jeans, her hair released from its usual professional styling to fall in soft waves around her shoulders. Without her uniform, she looked younger, more approachable, and Theodore realized this was the first time he'd ever seen her as anything other than his employee. She was so absorbed in her reading that she didn't notice his presence. Theodore stepped closer, trying to make out the book's title, and felt his breath catch. The pages were covered with dense Greek text, and in the margins, Evelyn had made careful notations in what appeared to be multiple languages. "Sophocles," he said softly, unable to keep the surprise from his voice. Evelyn startled, looking up with wide eyes. For a moment, she seemed like a child caught in some forbidden act, but then her composure returned, though she didn't immediately close the book. "Mr. Lancaster, I didn't expect anyone to be awake. I couldn't sleep. The storm." He gestured vaguely toward the windows, then nodded at her book. "Is that the original Greek?" "Yes." She traced a finger along the margin where she'd written careful notes. "I find Sophocles particularly beautiful in the original language. Translations never quite capture the music of his words." Theodore stared at her, his mind struggling to reconcile this image with the woman who'd been quietly managing his domestic life for 3 years. "You read ancient Greek for pleasure?" "Among other languages." Evelyn's voice carried a hint of defiance now, as if she'd decided to abandon the careful neutrality that had defined their relationship. "I find classical literature soothing, especially during storms." "May I?" He gestured toward the empty chair across from her. She nodded, though her posture remained guarded. Theodore sat down, studying the book's pages with newfound respect. The text was heavily annotated, with cross-references and comparative notes that spoke of deep, scholarly engagement. "Where did you learn to read Greek?" he asked. Evelyn was quiet for so long that Theodore thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of carefully guarded memories. "University of Chicago. I completed my doctorate in classical studies 12 years ago." The words hit Theodore like a physical blow. "Doctorate? You have a PhD?" "Summa cum laude." She closed the book gently, her fingers tracing its worn cover. "My dissertation focused on linguistic evolution in Hellenistic Egypt. Specifically, the influence of Coptic dialects on Greek correspondence among the educated merchant class." Theodore felt the room spinning slightly. But your resume, the background check, listed my domestic experience, which was accurate. I worked as a housekeeper for Professor Whitman at Northwestern while completing my graduate studies. After graduation, I continued in domestic work by choice, not necessity. Choice. The word came out sharper than Theodore intended. Why would someone with a doctorate choose to clean houses? Evelyn's smile was sad and knowing. Because the academic world isn't as meritocratic as people believe. My research was groundbreaking, my recommendation stellar, but somehow opportunities always went to candidates who looked more like what university committees expected scholars to look like. The implication hung between them, uncomfortable and undeniable. Theodore thought of his own automatic assumptions, his casual dismissal of her intelligence based on her appearance and position. After 2 years of adjunct positions and rejection letters, I realized I could either fight a system designed to exclude me or find peace in work that valued competence over credentials. She opened the book again, her fingers finding a familiar passage. I chose peace. But your talents, your knowledge, you're wasting them. Am I? Evelyn looked up, her dark eyes reflecting the lamplight. I read the literature I love. I study the languages that fascinate me. And I live without the politics and prejudice that made academic life unbearable. How is that waste? Theodore struggled to process this revelation. All this time, you've been translating my correspondence, managing my schedule, and you could have been teaching at university? I could have been trying to teach at a university, she corrected. There's a significant difference between possibility and reality. He thought of the dinner party, his cruel challenge, the humiliation he'd intended to inflict. Tonight, when I offered that translation challenge, you must have wanted to destroy me. For a moment, yes. Her honesty was startling. But anger is exhausting, Mr. Lancaster. I learned long ago that proving myself to people who don't want to see my worth is a losing game. Then why did you do it? Why translate the papyrus? Evelyn was quiet for several heartbeats, considering her answer. Because Kyra deserved to have her words heard. Love that's strong shouldn't remain locked away simply because the people who could free it lack the skill or will to try. Her words carried layers of meaning that made Theodore deeply uncomfortable. He realized she wasn't just talking about ancient correspondence, but about all the voices that went unheard, all the intelligence that was dismissed, all the talent that was wasted because it came wrapped in unexpected packages. Your professors at University of Chicago, he said slowly, they must have been devastated to lose someone of your caliber. Most of them never noticed I'd gone. Evelyn's voice held no bitterness, just weary acceptance. Academic institutions are remarkably good at overlooking brilliance when it doesn't fit their expectations. Theodore thought of his own collection, his pride in owning artifacts whose meaning he couldn't comprehend. All these years, I've been surrounded by your expertise and never realized it. You never asked. She stood up, closing the book and preparing to leave. People see what they expect to see, Mr. Lancaster. You expected efficient domestic help, so that's what you noticed. Wait, the word came out more urgently than Theodore intended. Please, I'm trying to understand. Evelyn paused, studying his face in the lamplight. Understand what? How I could have been so blind. How someone of your intelligence and education could have been invisible to me for 3 years. The same way you're invisible to your doorman, your dry cleaner, or the person who bags your groceries. Service workers exist in a parallel world that the privileged rarely acknowledge. Her words stung because they were true. Theodore realized that in his world of wealth and connections, entire categories of people simply didn't register as fully human. They were functions, roles, necessary, but ultimately forgettable components of his comfortable life. The papyrus, he said suddenly. You recognized it immediately, didn't you? Even before Dr. Voss examined it. I noticed it the day you hung it. 3rd century Hellenistic script with Coptic influences, probably from Alexandria's merchant district. The subject matter was obviously personal correspondence based on the letter forms and phrasing patterns. And you said nothing. You didn't ask. Evelyn's smile was gentle but pointed. Besides, you were so pleased with owning something mysterious. I saw no reason to spoil your enjoyment with mundane academic analysis. Theodore felt a flush of shame, remembering his proud display of the impossible translation challenge. I made myself look like a fool tonight. You made yourself look like someone who believes intelligence correlates with social position. Unfortunately, that's a very common form of foolishness. The storm's intensity was beginning to diminish, and in the relative quiet, Theodore could hear the old house settling around them. Dawn was still hours away, but something fundamental had shifted in the space between them. Evelyn, he said carefully, would you be willing to tell me more about your research? About the work you did before I became your housekeeper? She considered the request. Why? Because I'm beginning to realize that the most valuable things in my life might be the ones I've been too arrogant to notice. For the first time since he'd known her, Evelyn Carter smiled at him with genuine warmth, and Theodore understood that he was being offered something far more precious than any artifact in his collection, the chance to see the world through truly educated eyes. The emergency lighting cast a warm glow over the kitchen as Evelyn moved to make fresh coffee, her movements graceful and unhurried despite the late hour. Theodore remained seated at the small table, watching her with new eyes as she worked. The simple domestic task took on different meaning now that he understood the brilliant mind behind it. Tell me about your dissertation, he said as she measured coffee grounds. Linguistic evolution in Hellenistic Egypt sounds fascinating. Evelyn glanced over her shoulder, surprise flickering across her features. You really want to know? I really want to know. She poured water into the coffee maker, considering where to begin. Language is like a river, constantly changing course based on the landscape it encounters. In Alexandria, Greek was the language of commerce and education, but it couldn't remain pure when surrounded by Coptic speakers who brought their own grammatical structures and vocabulary. Theodore leaned forward, genuinely intrigued. So, the papyrus upstairs is a perfect example of what I studied. Cairo was clearly educated, writing in formal Greek, but she uses certain phrase constructions that only make sense if you understand how Coptic sentence patterns influenced everyday speech. Evelyn's voice grew animated as she warmed to her subject. She writes, "My heart carries your words like treasures instead of the more classical. Your words are treasured in my heart." That construction is pure Coptic influence. Remarkable. Theodore watched her face as she spoke, noting how her entire demeanor transformed when discussing her passion. How long did your research take? 7 years. 3 for my master's degree, 4 for the doctorate. She poured 2 cups of coffee, the rich aroma filling the kitchen. I spent 18 months in Egypt, working with papyrus fragments in the Cairo Museum. Some days I'd spend 12 hours bent over manuscripts that hadn't been touched by human hands for 2,000 years. She set a cup before him and settled back in her chair, cradling her own mug between her palms. There's something magical about reading words written by people who've been dust for millennia. Their hopes, fears, love letters, shopping lists. They become real again when someone takes the time to understand their language. Theodore sipped his coffee, studying Evelyn's animated expression. You must have loved it. I did. More than anything I'd ever experienced. Her smile faded slightly, which made leaving it even more difficult. What happened? Really, I mean, beyond the general challenges you mentioned. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the table surface. My advisor, Professor Harrison, was brilliant but old-fashioned. He believed classical studies should remain classical, if you understand my meaning. When I defended my dissertation, he praised my scholarship but suggested I might be happier in African studies or modern languages. Theodore winced. Because of your race. He never said it directly. Academic prejudice is usually more subtle. But when every fellowship went to less qualified candidates, when conference presentations were mysteriously canceled, when job interviews ended with comments about cultural fit, the message became clear. That's unconscionable. It's reality. Evelyn's voice held no self-pity, just matter-of-fact acceptance. The field I loved didn't love me back. so I made peace with loving it from a distance. Theodore felt a deep shame settling in his chest. And then you ended up working for people like me. People who appreciate competence and don't ask uncomfortable questions about my credentials. She took a sip of coffee. Present company excluded, of course. Despite everything, Theodore found himself chuckling. I suppose I walked into that. You practically sprinted into it. Her smile took the sting from her words. Though to be fair, most employers don't expect their housekeepers to discuss ancient Mediterranean linguistics over midnight coffee. Most employers are idiots. The words surprised Theodore, even as he spoke them. All this time, I could have been learning from someone with genuine expertise, and instead I've been showing off artifacts I can't even read. Your collection is impressive regardless. You have excellent taste in acquisitions, but no understanding of what I'm acquiring. I buy mysteries I can't solve, texts I can't read, artifacts whose significance I can only guess at. He paused, struck by a sudden realization. How many pieces of my collection could you translate? Evelyn considered the question. The Roman coins are straightforward. Your medieval manuscripts are mostly liturgical Latin, though there's one that appears to be a merchant's account from Constantinople. The Egyptian pottery has hieroglyphic inscriptions that are beyond my expertise, but the Greek ostraca fragments are fascinating. Ostraca, pottery shards used as writing material, cheaper than papyrus. Yours contain what appear to be tax records from Oxyrhynchus, probably 2nd century CE. Her eyes lit up with scholarly enthusiasm. They're actually quite valuable for understanding daily economic life in Roman Egypt. Theodore stared at her in amazement. I bought those pieces because they looked impressive. I had no idea they contained tax records. History is everywhere, if you know how to read it. That's what I loved most about my studies. Every fragment tells a story about real people living real lives. Like Kyra and Alexios. Exactly. Love transcends time when someone takes the trouble to preserve and translate it. Evelyn met his eyes across the table. That's why I couldn't let her words remain silent tonight, regardless of your motives for challenging me. Theodore felt heat rise in his cheeks. My motives were inexcusable. I was trying to humiliate you for my guest's entertainment. I know, her directness was startling, but your humiliation revealed something beautiful. Kyra's love deserved that moment of recognition. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, the storm's fury diminishing to a steady whisper against the windows. Theodore found himself studying Evelyn's face in the lamplight, seeing intelligence and dignity that had always been there, but that he'd been too privileged and prejudiced to notice. You know, he said thoughtfully, I've spent my entire adult life collecting beautiful things I don't understand. Art, artifacts, even people in my parties. I surround myself with impressive objects and assume that ownership equals appreciation. Understanding requires effort. Ownership just requires money. Harsh, but accurate. Theodore leaned back in his chair. What would you do with my collection if it were yours? Evelyn's eyes sparkled with interest. You mean how would I display it? I mean, how would you bring it to life? Make it meaningful instead of just decorative. She was quiet for a moment, clearly considering the possibilities. I'd research the provenance of each piece, understand its historical context. That Roman correspondence folder you keep in the library, those letters tell the story of a family's business dealings during the reign of Hadrian. With proper translation and context, they could illuminate daily life in the empire. You could do that. I could try, though it would take considerable time and research. She paused, meeting his gaze. Why do you ask? Theodore felt something shifting inside him, a recognition that his life had been built on superficial accumulation rather than genuine understanding. Because I'm beginning to realize that collecting beautiful things means nothing if you can't appreciate their true value. And what do you think their true value is? Connection. To history, to other human beings, to something larger than my own small world. He gestured around the kitchen, this humble space where he'd learned more in 2 hours than in years of expensive dinner parties. Like this conversation. I've lived in this house for 15 years and never had a more meaningful discussion with anyone. Evelyn's smile was warm and genuine. Perhaps meaningful discussions require more than expensive wine and impressive credentials. Perhaps they require respect for the person you're talking with, regardless of their position in your household. That would be a good start. Theodore felt a strange sensation in his chest, as if something long frozen was beginning to thaw. For the first time in years, possibly decades, he was having a conversation based on mutual interest rather than social positioning or business advantage. It felt revolutionary. "Evelyn," he said carefully, "when this storm passes and things return to normal, would you be interested in a different kind of arrangement? One that made better use of your actual skills?" She studied his face, searching for sincerity. "What kind of arrangement? I'm not entirely sure yet, but I know that having a brilliant classical scholar managing my household is like using a Stradivarius as a doorstop. There has to be a better way." For the first time since he'd known her, Evelyn Carter looked at Theodore Lancaster with something approaching hope. The morning sun broke through the storm clouds just after 7, casting brilliant light across the snow-covered landscape. Theodore had managed only 2 hours of restless sleep after his revelatory conversation with Evelyn, his mind churning with new possibilities and uncomfortable realizations about his own prejudices. He dressed carefully in a navy cashmere sweater and pressed khakis, trying to project casual confidence while his internal world felt completely upended. Downstairs, the smell of fresh coffee and bacon guided him toward the dining room, where Evelyn had prepared an elaborate breakfast buffet despite having been awake most of the night. She moved efficiently between the kitchen and dining area, wearing her usual navy uniform, her hair once again pulled back in its professional style. But Theodore noticed subtle differences now. The way she carried herself with quiet dignity, the intelligence that sparked in her eyes when she thought no one was watching, the careful precision of her movements that spoke of someone accustomed to handling delicate, valuable things. Dr. Voss was already seated at the mahogany table, examining the papyrus display through her magnifying glass while sipping coffee from Theodore's finest china. She looked up as he entered, her expression carefully neutral. "Good morning, Theodore. I trust you slept well despite our dramatic evening." "Well enough," he lied, pouring himself coffee from the silver service. "The storm seems to be clearing. Indeed, I've been studying your papyrus again this morning. The more I examine it, the more impressed I become with last night's translation. Whoever provided it has an extraordinary grasp of Hellenistic Greek dialects." Theodore felt his stomach tighten. In the cold light of morning, with the social world about to reconvene, the intimacy of his midnight conversation with Evelyn felt dangerous and exposed. "Helena, about last night. I think perhaps we all got carried away by the drama of the storm and the wine. These things can seem more significant in the moment than they actually are." Dr. Voss set down her magnifying glass, fixing him with a sharp stare. "Are you suggesting the translation was somehow inaccurate?" "I'm suggesting that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And the claim that my housekeeper possesses advanced degrees in classical studies is quite extraordinary." The words felt like ashes in his mouth, even as he spoke them. But Senator Phillips was emerging from his guest room, followed by Judge Morrison and the Hartwells, and Theodore felt the familiar pressure to maintain his social standing among Chicago's elite. "Ah, Theodore," Senator Phillips called out heartily. "What an adventure! Though I must say, your staff managed our unexpected stay admirably. Breakfast looks magnificent." "Evelyn is quite competent," Theodore replied, his voice carefully modulated to suggest nothing had changed between them. "She's been well trained for these situations." Dr. Voss's eyebrows rose at his tone, but she said nothing as the other guests gathered around the breakfast buffet. Evelyn continued her service with perfect professionalism, but Theodore caught her glancing at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. As the group settled into breakfast conversation, Judge Morrison raised the subject Theodore had been dreading. "I have to say, last night's entertainment was quite memorable. That translation business was extraordinary. Helena, you seemed genuinely impressed by the accuracy." "I was indeed," Dr. Voss replied carefully, her eyes fixed on Theodore. "It was some of the most sophisticated linguistic analysis I've encountered outside academic circles." "Come now," Jonathan Hartwell laughed, cutting into his Eggs Benedict. Surely you're not suggesting Theodore's housekeeper is some kind of hidden scholar? The casual dismissal in his tone made Theodore wince, but he found himself nodding along rather than defending Evelyn's credentials. As I mentioned earlier, these things can seem more dramatic than they actually are. The storm, the wine, the late hour. I suspect what we witnessed was simply an entertaining coincidence. Coincidence? Dr. Voss's voice carried a dangerous edge. Theodore, are you seriously suggesting that a detailed, accurate translation of a complex ancient text was accidental? I'm suggesting that we shouldn't draw hasty conclusions about someone's academic background based on a single dramatic moment. Theodore avoided looking toward the kitchen, where he knew Evelyn could hear every word. After all, there are many ways someone might acquire fragments of knowledge without formal education. Fragments. Dr. Voss's voice rose slightly. The translation included specific historical references, proper names, geographical details, and sophisticated understanding of linguistic evolution. Those aren't fragments, Theodore. That's expertise. Senator Phillips leaned forward with interest. You really believe the housekeeper has genuine academic credentials? I believe, Dr. Voss said firmly, that intelligence doesn't recognize social boundaries, and that our assumptions about who possesses knowledge often reveal more about our prejudices than about reality. Mrs. Pemberton giggled nervously. Well, this is all very philosophical, but surely we're making too much of what was probably just a lucky guess. Lucky guess. Dr. Voss's composure was beginning to crack. She provided details about Roman military postings, trade routes, and cultural practices that would require years of specialized study to master. Theodore felt trapped between his growing respect for Evelyn and his desperate need to maintain his position among his peers. Helena, I appreciate your democratic ideals, but let's be realistic. Advanced degrees leave paper trails. Academic achievements create professional networks. If my housekeeper possessed the credentials you're suggesting, why would she be working in domestic service? The question hung in the air like an accusation. In the kitchen doorway, Evelyn appeared with fresh coffee, her face a mask of professional neutrality that Theodore now recognized as carefully controlled pain. Perhaps, Dr. Voss said icily, because the academic world isn't as meritocratic as we'd like to believe. Perhaps because talent and intelligence aren't always rewarded when they come wrapped in unexpected packages. Or perhaps Judge Morrison interjected with the authority of someone accustomed to settling disputes. We're overthinking what was simply an amusing evening's entertainment. Theodore offered a challenge. It was met creatively, and now we can all return to our normal lives with a fun story to tell. The dismissal was complete and devastating. Theodore watched as Evelyn's professional mask slipped for just an instant, revealing hurt so profound it made his chest ache. But instead of defending her, instead of standing up for the brilliant woman whose midnight conversation had opened his eyes to his own shallow existence, he found himself nodding along with Judge Morrison's assessment. Exactly right. An amusing evening, nothing more. Theodore accepted fresh coffee from Evelyn without meeting her eyes. I'm sure we'll all look back on this storm as quite an adventure. Dr. Voss stared at him with barely contained disgust. Theodore, you're making a mistake you'll regret. The only mistake would be reading more significance into entertainment than it deserves. The words felt like poison leaving his mouth, but the approving nods from his guest provided the social validation he'd spent his life pursuing. Evelyn continued serving coffee with steady hands, but Theodore could see the careful distance she was rebuilding between them, the protective walls going back up around her wounded dignity. Well, Senator Phillips announced, checking his phone, my driver says the roads are clear. I should probably head home before the next weather system moves in. As the guests began preparing for departure, Theodore felt a growing panic. In choosing social acceptance over truth, he betrayed not just Evelyn, but his own newfound understanding of what really mattered. But the momentum of his choice was carrying him forward, and he seemed powerless to stop it. Thank you for a truly memorable evening, Mrs. Pemberton gushed as she gathered her things. And do give our compliments to your housekeeper. She managed everything beautifully. I'll be sure to tell her, Theodore replied, though he couldn't bring himself to look in Evelyn's direction. Dr. Voss was the last to leave, pausing at the door to deliver one final judgment. You know, Theodore, I've spent my career studying ancient civilizations that fell because they refused to recognize value when it didn't match their expectations. I never thought I'd watch someone make that same mistake in real time. After the door closed behind her, Theodore stood alone in his foyer, surrounded by the artifacts he'd collected but never understood, knowing that he'd just made the worst decision of his life. In the kitchen, he could hear Evelyn quietly cleaning up from breakfast, and he realized that the brilliant light he'd glimpsed in their midnight conversation had been extinguished by his own cowardice. The woman he was falling in love with had become invisible to him once again, not because she'd changed, but because he'd chosen blindness over the difficult courage of seeing clearly. The mansion felt oppressively quiet after the last guest departed. Theodore wandered through rooms that suddenly seemed too large, too empty, filled with beautiful objects that now struck him as meaningless decoration. The papyrus display drew his attention repeatedly, Kyra's ancient words of love seeming to mock his cowardice. He'd spent the morning systematically destroying the most genuine connection he'd experienced in years, and the weight of that choice pressed down on him like a physical burden. In the kitchen, Evelyn worked with mechanical precision, cleaning crystal glasses and silver serving pieces with the same meticulous care she'd always shown. But something fundamental had shifted in her demeanor. The spark of intellectual curiosity that had illuminated her face during their midnight conversation had been carefully extinguished, replaced by the neutral professionalism of someone who'd learned not to hope for more than basic courtesy. Theodore stood in the doorway, watching her work, searching for words that might bridge the chasm his betrayal had created. Evelyn, she didn't look up from the wine glasses she was polishing. Yes, sir. The formal distance in her voice cut deeper than any accusation could have. About this morning, about what I said to my guests. You said nothing inappropriate, sir. You maintained appropriate boundaries between employer and employee. Her tone was perfectly respectful and utterly cold. I understand completely. Do you? Because I'm not sure I understand it myself. Now she did look up, her dark eyes reflecting hurt that she quickly masked with professional composure. Mr. Lancaster, you had guests to consider. Important people with expectations about how your household should function. It was entirely reasonable to discourage speculation about my background. Reasonable, Theodore repeated, the word tasting bitter. Is that what we're calling it? Evelyn set down the glass she'd been polishing, her movements deliberately controlled. What would you prefer to call it? Cowardice? Prejudice? A complete failure of character on my part? Sir, you don't owe me any explanations. Our arrangement has always been professional. Last night was an anomaly brought on by unusual circumstances. Her calm dismissal of their connection stung more than anger would have. Theodore stepped into the kitchen, desperate to recapture some fragment of the intimacy they'd shared. It wasn't an anomaly for me. That conversation was the most real thing that's happened in this house in years. Reality is subjective, Mr. Lancaster. This morning provided necessary clarity about our respective positions. Theodore watched her retreat behind the fortress of formality she'd built, and realized he was losing her completely, not just as an employee, but as the remarkable woman he'd glimpsed in the emergency lighting of a stormbound night. What if I told you I want to change those positions? What if I offered you something different? Evelyn's hands stilled on the silverware she was arranging. Different how? I meant what I said last night about finding better use for your skills. You could curate my collection properly, translate the pieces that need translation, help me understand what I've been blindly accumulating. As what? Your personal archaeologist. There was no warmth in her voice, only tired skepticism. Mr. Lancaster, I appreciate the gesture, but we both know how that would appear to your social circle. Dr. Voss already suspects more than you're comfortable with. Theodore felt heat rise in his cheeks. This isn't about appearances. Everything in your world is about appearances. That's what this morning proved. The accusation hung between them, impossible to deny. Theodore had built his entire life around managing perceptions, maintaining status, preserving the comfortable fiction that wealth and social position equated to worth and intelligence. You're right, he admitted quietly. About everything. About appearances, about my cowardice, about the way I treated you this morning. Recognition doesn't change reality, sir. It could, if I chose to change the reality. Evelyn finally met his eyes fully, and Theodore saw the careful hope she was trying to suppress. Change it how? By being honest about who you are, about your education, your expertise, your value beyond domestic service. Theodore's voice grew stronger as he spoke. By giving you the respect and recognition you deserve, regardless of what anyone else thinks. And your friends? Your business associates? The people whose opinions matter to your success? Theodore considered the question seriously. Senator Phillips' Harbor Development Project, Judge Morrison's social connections, the intricate web of relationships that defined his professional world. All of it built on the assumption that certain people mattered and others didn't, that intelligence and worth could be determined by appearance and position. They'll have to adjust their assumptions, he said finally. Just like I had to adjust mine. That's a significant risk for you to take. Not as significant as the risk of losing something genuinely valuable, because I was too proud to admit I'd been wrong. Evelyn studied his face, searching for sincerity behind words that could easily be motivated by guilt or momentary sentiment. What exactly are you proposing? Theodore realized he was standing at a crossroads that would define not just their relationship, but the kind of man he chose to be going forward. The safe path led back to his comfortable assumptions and social acceptance. The other path led into unknown territory where his housekeeper was his intellectual equal and his prejudices had no place to hide. I'm proposing that we start over. That you tell me about your research, your expertise, your dreams that got derailed by other people's limitations. I'm proposing that instead of hiding your intelligence, we celebrate it. Celebrate it how? However you want. We could co-author papers about the pieces in my collection. We could host salons for scholars who appreciate knowledge over pedigree. We could travel to Egypt and Greece so you could continue your research. Theodore's voice grew more animated as possibilities multiplied. We could do anything that honors what you're capable of instead of hiding it. And if your social circle disapproves? If business opportunities disappear because your associates think you've lost your mind? Theodore thought of Dr. Voss's disgusted expression as she left, her warning about civilizations that fell because they couldn't recognize value. He thought of Kyra's words about love worth any risk, and realized that some things mattered more than maintaining comfortable illusions. Then I'll find new associates. Better ones. People who judge worth by character and intelligence instead of appearance and position. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the marble countertop. When she spoke, her voice carried decades of disappointment carefully controlled. Mr. Lancaster, you're describing a beautiful fantasy, but I've learned that people's good intentions rarely survive social pressure. When your first business deal falls through because someone objects to your unconventional household arrangements, when your first dinner party becomes awkward because I'm introduced as something other than the help, you'll remember why things were simpler before. Her words stung because they reflected his own fears accurately. But Theodore realized that fear had been his constant companion for too long, keeping him safe but ultimately empty. Maybe you're right, he admitted. Maybe I'll fail the first test of real courage that comes along. But maybe I won't. Maybe discovering that I've been living with genius for 3 years without recognizing it has changed something fundamental about how I see the world. And maybe the storm created a temporary intimacy that feels more significant than it actually was. Theodore stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes, close enough to smell the subtle scent of her perfume beneath the practical soap she used for work. There's one way to find out, he said softly. We could try trusting each other. You could risk believing that I might be capable of growth, and I could risk proving that my comfort matters less than your dignity. For the first time since morning, Evelyn's professional mask slipped slightly. And if we're both wrong? If this ends badly for both of us, then at least we'll have tried something real instead of settling for safe illusions. Outside, The last of the storm clouds were clearing, revealing brilliant blue sky that made the snow-covered landscape sparkle like diamonds. Theodore waited, hardly breathing, as Evelyn Carter made the choice that would determine whether love could truly transcend the boundaries that society had built between them. 6 months later, the warm June breeze drifted through the open French doors of Theodore's study, carrying the scent of blooming roses from the garden where Evelyn had planted new varieties she'd researched from ancient Roman agricultural texts. The transformation of both the mansion and their lives had been gradual but profound, like watching a carefully tended garden come into full flower. Theodore sat at his mahogany desk, reviewing the final proofs of their co-authored paper, Linguistic Evolution in Hellenistic Correspondence, new translations from the Lancaster collection. The academic journal that had accepted their work was prestigious enough to satisfy his ego while being progressive enough to value scholarship over social pedigree. Dr. Voss had written the foreword, her enthusiasm for their research evident in every carefully crafted paragraph. The printer confirmed delivery for Thursday, Evelyn said, entering the study with 2 cups of coffee and the comfortable confidence that had gradually replaced her former deference. She wore a flowing emerald dress that brought out the warmth in her dark skin, her hair styled in soft waves that framed her face beautifully. The transformation from housekeeper's uniform to scholar's attire had been just one of many changes that marked their new relationship. Nervous? Theodore asked, accepting his coffee with a smile that still felt miraculous after months of discovering genuine affection. Terrified, she admitted, settling into the leather armchair across from his desk. It's been 12 years since I published anything. The academic world moves quickly. The academic world will have to catch up with us, Theodore replied firmly. Our research is solid. Our translations are flawless. And if anyone has a problem with our unconventional collaboration, they can discuss it with Northwestern's Department of Classical Studies. The offer from Northwestern had come 3 weeks ago, a joint appointment that would allow Evelyn to teach while continuing her research using Theodore's collection. The irony of her return to academia through the very artifacts that had once symbolized as ignorant accumulation wasn't lost on either of them. Senator Phillips called this morning. Theodore mentioned casually, watching Evelyn's expression for any sign of discomfort. He wanted to discuss the harbor development project again. And I told him I decided not to invest. Turns out the environmental impact studies were inadequate, and I've developed a new appreciation for preserving historical sites rather than destroying them for profit. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. That's a significant financial decision. It's a significant moral decision. The financial aspects are secondary. The change in Theodore's priorities had been one of the most remarkable aspects of their evolving relationship. His business dealings had become more ethical, his social circle more diverse, his entire worldview fundamentally altered by exposure to Evelyn's values and intelligence. Dr. Martinez from the Oriental Institute is coming for dinner tomorrow, Evelyn said, consulting her notebook. He's bringing the Coptic manuscripts we discussed, along with his graduate student who's working on merchant correspondence from Oxyrhynchus. Excellent. And Friday Salon. 12 confirmed attendees. Professor Chun from University of Chicago, 2 researchers from the Field Museum, and several independent scholars who rarely get opportunities to present their work in informal settings. Theodore smiled, remembering his first anxiety about hosting scholars in his home. The idea of replacing his superficial dinner parties with genuine intellectual gatherings had terrified him initially, but the results had been transformative. Real conversation, authentic connections, and the discovery that intelligence was far more engaging than gossip or business networking. I have something for you, he said, reaching into his desk drawer to retrieve a small velvet box. Evelyn's eyes widened slightly. Theodore, what is this? Open it. Inside the box lay a delicate gold ring set with an ancient Roman coin that had been carefully mounted to preserve its historical integrity. The coin bore the image of Minerva, goddess of wisdom, with perfectly preserved Latin text around the edge. It's beautiful, Evelyn breathed, lifting the ring to examine the craftsmanship. But I can't accept something this valuable. Actually, you can, because it's not just a gift. Theodore's voice carried a nervous tremor that made Evelyn look up sharply. "It's a question." The words hung between them as Evelyn studied his face, reading the hope and vulnerability written there as clearly as any ancient text. "Theodore, I know this is complicated. I know our relationship started under impossible circumstances and that we've had to rebuild everything from scratch. But these past 6 months have shown me what my life could be with someone who challenges me intellectually, who shares my passion for discovery, who makes me want to be worthy of her respect." Evelyn set the ring box on the desk, her hands trembling slightly. "Are you asking what I think you're asking? I'm asking if you'd consider marrying a reformed, arrogant billionaire who's still learning how to see the world clearly, but who loves you more than all the artifacts in his collection combined." Tears sparkled in Evelyn's eyes as she looked from the ring to Theodore's earnest face. "You realize this will scandalize half of Chicago's social elite? Good. They could use some scandalization. And your business associates will assume you've lost your mind. Maybe I have. Maybe falling in love with your intellectual equal while discovering your own ignorance is a form of beautiful madness." Evelyn laughed, the sound rich with joy and possibility. "Dr. Voss warned you this would be complicated. Dr. Voss also said I'd regret not recognizing value when I found it. She was right about everything else. And if the academic world thinks we're an unlikely pair, then the academic world will have to expand its definitions of partnership and collaboration." Theodore leaned forward, his voice growing more confident. "Evelyn, you've spent years hiding your brilliance because other people couldn't see past their prejudices. I spent years collecting beautiful things without understanding their meaning. Together, we've created something neither of us could have achieved alone. A true partnership of equals. In every sense. Intellectual, emotional, spiritual." Theodore's smile was radiant with possibility. "Plus, imagine the research opportunities. We could travel to every major archaeological site in the Mediterranean. We could establish a foundation for supporting overlooked scholars. We could spend our lives bringing ancient voices back to life." Evelyn picked up the ring again, noting how perfectly the ancient coin had been preserved and mounted. "Minerva, goddess of wisdom. I thought it was appropriate for someone who taught me that true intelligence has nothing to do with social position and everything to do with curiosity, courage, and compassion. You realize I'm going to insist on a prenuptial agreement that protects my academic independence. I'd be insulted if you didn't. And I want our wedding to include readings from Kyra's letter. The woman who brought us together deserves recognition." "Perfect. Her love story helped create ours." Evelyn slipped the ring onto her finger, watching how the afternoon sunlight caught the ancient gold and made Minerva's profile shine with eternal wisdom. "Until stars forget their places in the sky." "Until stars forget their places in the sky," Theodore confirmed, reaching across the desk to take her hand. Outside, the June afternoon was perfect, warm and bright, with the promise of summer adventures ahead. Inside, two people who had found love in the most unexpected circumstances were planning a future built on mutual respect, shared passion, and the revolutionary idea that true worth had nothing to do with social position and everything to do with the courage to see clearly. The papyrus on the wall caught the sunlight, Kyra's ancient words of love glowing as if they'd been written yesterday. Across 2 millennia, one woman's declaration of devotion had created a bridge between past and present, proving that some truths transcend time, class, and every barrier that small minds erect between hearts that recognize each other as home. Do you believe people can really change as dramatically as Theodore did? Share this video with someone who needs to hear that love and respect can bloom in the most unexpected places, and subscribe for more stories that will restore your faith in human transformation. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as interesting as you can ever imagine, so do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.